The year is 1944. The European war machine is grinding towards its inevitable conclusion, but for the defeated, the fear remains total. On a dusty road outside Amarillo, Texas, the morning sun had barely pierced a relentless, vast horizon when a convoy of trucks, weary from their cross-country journey, sputtered to a halt. The air, heavy with the scent of mesquite and dry earth, was broken only by the low hiss of the cooling engines and the incessant, high-pitched chorus of cicadas. Inside the dark, stuffy confines of one truck sat a group of German prisoners. These were not the frontline infantrymen, but women, former auxiliary personnel of the Luftwaffe, radio operators, clerks, and nurses, captured near Cherbourg and now transported across an ocean to a land that, in their minds, was synonymous with terror. Among them was 24-year-old Lieselot Minart, her khaki uniform deeply creased, her eyes hollowed by weeks of relentless anxiety and the psychological strain of defeat and transit. Lieselot, like every German citizen under pervasive influence of the Third Reich's propaganda, had constructed a terrifying mental image of America. A cage of steel, a land ruled by cold machinery and fire, where captured enemies would face the worst forms of humiliation and torture. The rumors whispered among the auxiliaries had been vivid and consistent, carefully cultivated by the Nazi regime. Captured Germans would be beaten, starved, made to dig their own graves under the blazing, indifferent desert sun, or subjected to experiments. These stories were not just rumor. They were psychological weapons, designed to ensure obedience and instill a desperate, final loyalty. The back doors of the truck creaked open, the sudden rush of bright Texas light momentarily blinding. Lieselot braced herself, mentally preparing for the inevitable shouting. The sharp crack of a rifle butt, the curses, and immediate descent into the brutal chaos she had been taught to expect from the materialistic, uncultured American savages. Instead, a calm, distinctly slow voice, its rhythm strange and unfamiliar to her German ear, spoke in a measured tone. "Ma'am, watch your step." A man stood waiting outside the truck. He wore a tan hat with a wide brim. His sleeves were rolled up over tan forearms, and dust coated his sturdy leather boots. He was strikingly different from the uniformed, barking soldiers of the Wehrmacht or the grim, heavily armed guard she had imagined. He wasn't a standard military guard at all. To Lieselot, he looked exactly like the figure she had only ever seen in forbidden Western films before the war, a cowboy. Behind him, the Texas sky stretched out into a blinding, infinite blue, a shocking and vast canvas that seemed unreal, extending to the very edge of the flat horizon. Lieselot blinked, disorientation replacing her fear. The air that rushed into her lungs smelled of dried grass, hay, and horses, a natural, agricultural smell, not the metallic, acrid scent of gunpowder and industrial decay she had grown used to. Around her, the other women climbed down from the truck hesitantly, clutching their small, meager bags of belongings. There were no chains, no barking dogs, and no aggressive shouts. Only a handful of American soldiers leaned casually on their rifles, observing the scene without any visible malice or intent to humiliate. The cowboy, his movements economical and calm, extended a tin cup towards Lieselot. It was filled with water, ice cold and clean, tasting purer than anything she had consumed since her capture near Cherbourg. She drank it greedily, draining the cup in a single swallow. He nodded, his expression gentle. Plenty more where that came from. Lieselot was left speechless, her rehearsed defiance evaporating. Everything she had been taught, that Americans were savages, factory slaves, morally degenerate criminals driven only by base greed and the worship of money, collided instantly with the quiet, simple dignity of the man before her. The serene scene of the Texas ranch, cattle moving lazily beyond distant fences, windmills turning slowly in the soft wind, the distant bark of a dog chasing shadows, refused to fit the narrative of the cruel, metallic cage she had been promised. The cowboy gestured toward a cluster of buildings and stables. "You folks will be helping out here. Feeding, cleaning, riding if you're up for it." Riding? The absurdity was almost comical. She had been steeling herself for shackles, not saddles. When the camp gates finally closed behind her, simple wooden fences, not imposing iron ones, Lieselot turned back to look at the open, inviting plains. For the first time in months, fear had been momentarily displaced by a single, fragile emotion: curiosity, half in disbelief, half in wonder. She whispered to herself, This is America." The narrative of the cruel monster had failed. For Lieselot Minnaert, the journey to America was an odyssey under the shadow of absolute dread, a fear meticulously engineered by the sophisticated propaganda apparatus of the Third Reich. Before her capture, before she ever saw the plains of Texas, Lieselot and every German she knew were certain that America meant a death sentence, or a fate worse than death. The Nazi state understood the power of fear in maintaining control and moral mobilization, and it systematically portrayed the United States not merely as a military enemy, but as a moral abyss. The propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to paint a picture of American society that justified hatred and prepared its people for the worst in case of capture. Posters plastered across German factory walls and public squares explicitly warned that captured soldiers, airmen, and auxiliary personnel will be tortured, starved, or used for horrific medical experiments, echoing the exact terror tactics the Axis powers themselves employed. Radio broadcasts and controlled newspapers described America as a land where true culture was dead, replaced by a degenerate, corrupt democracy where individual honor was erased by the overwhelming power of soulless greed, commercialism, and mass production. Lieselot, having served in the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps, understood that the threat was magnified for female prisoners. The rumors were sharp, persistent, and officially sanctioned. Captured German women would be sent to brutal labor camps with impossible workloads or, most terrifyingly, subjected to sexual abuse and exploitation by enemy soldiers. These were not mere campfire tales. These stories were whispered by officers, printed in official-looking pamphlets, and constantly reinforced, each repetition designed to solidify the image of the United States as a cruel, technologically disguised empire devoid of human morality or restraint. This terror was Lieselot's constant companion during the long voyage west, through the cramped, claustrophobic cargo holds of the Allied Liberty ships, and across the seemingly endless, desolate railways that traversed the American continent. It sat heavy in her stomach, a physical, sickening certainty that any moment now, the nightmare would begin. When the truck doors finally opened on that dusty Texas morning, and she found herself facing a smiling, calm cowboy instead of a screaming executioner, the trauma of the indoctrination met the reality of the moment with a deafening silence. The shock of the mundane, the calm voice, the offered water, the lack of immediate violence, was more disorienting than any anticipated cruelty. The guards offered food. They used polite language like please and thank you, common courtesies that were practically unheard of in the rigid, fear-based hierarchy of the German military. This unnaturally civil behavior was immediately misinterpreted through the lens of propaganda. Lieselot and the other women wondered if it was part of some elaborate trick, a psychological softening before the brutality began, or the food was perhaps poisoned. The terror was so deeply rooted that they could not process simple human kindness. The next morning, however, the gnawing, physical reality of hunger finally overcame the abstract, psychological terror of the propaganda. They ate the food, beef stew, fresh bread, butter, and even apple pie, and they realized a profound, immediate truth. The enemy they'd been taught to despise was feeding them better than their own rationed, starved army ever could. In a censored letter that she managed to send home, Lieselot articulated the initial, crushing cognitive dissonance. They told us we would be slaves, but here, even the guards say good morning. The sky is enormous, and the food tastes of mercy. For a woman raised under a dictatorship that measured strength and domination and required the humiliation of its enemies, the greatest shock was not the material comfort, but the simple, unearned dignity with which they were treated. America, Lieselot slowly realized, did not need to crush its captives to feel powerful. A quiet, unshakable moral confidence achieved the same psychological destruction of her beliefs, dismantling everything she had been taught about the war. The moment Lieselot Minard encountered the man in the tan hat outside the truck in Texas was a precise instant that the monolithic structure of Nazi propaganda began crack. This man, a figure that embodied the distinct, unforced culture of the American West, was the opposite of the cruel, factory-line gangster of the Reich had spent years creating in its official narrative. Lieselot, having braced for a confrontation characterized by shouting, menace, and immediate assertion of power, was instead greeted with a disorienting, profound calm. The man, whom she recognized instantly as a cowboy, a figure of mythological freedom and individualism from the pre-war German cinema, she was now forbidden to watch, spoke slowly, his accent a strange, lazy rhythm that required intense concentration to understand. His first words were not a command, but a courtesy. "Ma'am, watch your step." This use of polite language, the acknowledgement of her as a ma'am, despite her status as a prisoner of war, was the first, small, but devastating blow to the Nazi ideal of unmensch enemies. The propaganda had insisted that America was a place where honor was erased by degenerate democracy. Yet here was a man displaying simple, old-world courtesy, a man who looked like he belonged to the land, not to the factory. The ensuing interaction intensified the disorientation. Lieselot was handed a tin cup of water. It was ice-cold and clean, a detail that spoke volumes about American logistical power and, more importantly, a lack of spite in the rigid hierarchy of Nazi thought. Such a gesture from victor to vanquished, especially to a member of a defeated enemy force, was an act of weakness or, most likely, a malicious prelude to exploitation. Lieselot and the other women expected the water to be a test of their desperation, or even poisoned, a fear that was a direct result of their conditioning in society where cruelty was systematized. The cowboy's casual dignity only deepened the mystery. He stood watching them without aggression, his sleeves rolled up, his stance relaxed. When Lieselot drained the cup, his only response was a simple, non-judgmental nod and the assurance, "Plenty more where that came from." This easy generosity, utterly lacking in self-importance or malice, did not align with the propaganda's narrative of Americans as materialistic savages who valued money above all else. A savage would steal, humiliate, or destroy. This man simply offered sustenance and respect. The entire scene was characterized by a quiet, unforced dignity that was entirely foreign to Lieselot's experience under the Third Reich, which equated dignity with rigid hierarchy, rank, and the power to dominate others. The calm acceptance of their presence, the lack of shouting or theatrical cruelty, suggested a moral confidence that the Reich could never replicate. The Reich, in fact, required constant theatrical displays of dominance and brutality because its moral foundation was inherently unstable. America, by contrast, was so secure in its victory and its values rooted in the Geneva Convention and an abundance of resources, that it did not need to resort to humiliation. The cowboy, in his tan hat and dusty boots, standing under the impossible vastness of the Texas sky, became the first profound human contradiction to the entire Nazi worldview, a living, breathing testament to the fact that the monster they were taught to fear was, in reality, a man offering a cup of cold, clean water. The psychological leap that Lieselot Minard and her fellow German women were forced to make upon arriving at the Texas ranch can be summarized by a single, incredible contradiction. They had expected shackles, yet they were offered saddles. This shift from the expectation of brute, confining force to the reality of dynamic, practical engagement was the central mechanism by which their propaganda-fueled fear began to dissolve. Lieselot had mentally prepared for every form of hard labor imaginable: digging ditches, factory work behind razor wire, or back-breaking toil under the scorching sun, all carried out under the threat of punishment. The Nazi narrative promised an American captivity defined by dehumanization and the erasure of all personal identity. Instead, the rancher, the cowboy, pointed toward the corrals and the vast, open range. His instruction was simple, direct, and completely baffling. "You folks will be helping out here, feeding, cleaning, riding if you're up for it." The word riding struck Lieselot with the force of an absurdity. Horses were tools of leisure or military might. They were not instruments of punishment in the POW camp. The idea that German auxiliary personnel would be trusted with horses, tools, and the relatively immense freedom of movement required to manage cattle across the open Texas plains was utterly incompatible with the authoritarian, fear-based logic of the Reich. In the Nazi system, a prisoner was a danger to be contained and crushed, his or her agency to be eliminated. To give a captive a horse was to give him a means of immediate escape, an act of trust that was incomprehensible to a mind conditioned by total distrust and paranoia. This trust, initially perceived as madness or a trap, quickly revealed the practical and moral logic of the American system. The logic was not sentimental, but coldly efficient. America had millions of its young men fighting overseas, leaving vast agricultural lands short-handed. German POWs were a logistical solution to a labor shortage, and the most efficient labor was provided by a well-fed, reasonably treated, and motivated worker. The U.S. Army, bound by the Geneva Conventions, was not permitted to starve or humiliate its captives. It was, in fact, obligated to provide meaningful work and fair treatment. But to Lieselot and her group, this efficiency looked like compassion. The decision to use them on ranches, mending fences, tending livestock, and learning to ride, work that was skilled and provided a sense of purpose, stood in stark opposition to the dehumanizing labor they had anticipated. The shift from an environment of confinement and fear, shackles, to an environment of trust, skill, and mobility, saddles, was a moral and psychological revelation. It suggested that the American captors viewed them not as subhuman political enemies whose will must be broken, but as functional human beings whose labor had value. When Lieselot finally learned to guide her horse at a gentle trot, she felt the first surge of something that had been absent for months: personal freedom. It wasn't the political freedom of a civilian, but the psychological freedom of motion, purpose, and trust. The shackles of fear, imposed by the propaganda of her own country, began to fall away, replaced by the surprising, liberating burden of a saddle and the dignity of a job to be done. The most devastating weapon America deployed against the German prisoners was not a tank or a bomber, but an intangible quality that the Third Reich fundamentally failed to comprehend: moral confidence. This confidence was a bedrock upon which the entire POW experience was built, and it was a single factor that instantly invalidated years of intense Nazi propaganda. Lieselot Menard had been taught that Americans were cruel, driven by greed, and inherently savage. This narrative required America to be a morally weak and insecure nation, one that would need to use brutality and humiliation to assert its power over a defeated enemy. This is precisely what the Nazi state itself practiced, because its own moral foundation was so fragile and its system so reliant on the perpetual fear of a brutal hierarchy. But when Lieselot arrived, she witnessed the opposite. The United States, by 1944, had become the largest warden of prisoners in the world, holding over 400,000 Axis soldiers and civilians on its own soil. Yet, its management philosophy, enforced with meticulous, almost obsessive precision, adhered strictly to the Geneva Conventions. Prisoners were paid small wages for labor, allowed to write letters, attend religious services, engage in education, and even organize orchestras and theater groups. The logic was pragmatic, but the effect was profoundly moral. A well-treated, occupied prisoner was a stable, productive asset that required fewer guards and caused fewer problems. More importantly, however, American military planners understood the long game. The treatment of POWs would serve as a powerful, quiet form of psychological warfare and a lasting diplomatic statement. When these prisoners returned home, their testimony, the simple truth of being fed, treated with dignity, and given opportunities, would serve as an undeniable, positive ambassador for American values, directly contradicting the horrific narratives of the Nazi state. This policy revealed an unshakable national self-assurance. America was so confident in the moral superiority of its own system, even with its flaws, and so secure in its victory, that it did not need to stoop to the enemy's level. It did not need to humiliate its captives to prove its power. That quiet, unshakable confidence was the source of the shock Lieselot felt. The guards could afford to be polite. The rancher could afford to be trusting. And the system could afford to be generous because American power was not dependent on the subjugation of its enemies, but on the strength of its logistics, its industrial might, and its commitment to law, even for the defeated. When Lieselot saw the ample food, 3,200 calories a day, more than many American civilians, let alone rationed Germans, and wrote that the food tastes of mercy, she was articulating the cognitive dissonance caused by this moral confidence. She had expected to see a nation of fearful criminals. Instead, she found a nation so confident in its abundance and its legal framework that it treated its enemies with a dignity the Reich reserved only for its most privileged elite. This subtle, pervasive atmosphere of decency was a true weapon that began the systematic dismantling of the ideological fortress the Nazi state had built around her mind. By 1944, the United States had amassed the largest population of prisoners of war in modern history, exceeding 400,000 Axis personnel housed across the country. The logistical and moral challenge of managing this massive captive population was met not with arbitrary brutality, but with an almost obsessive precision in adhering to the terms of the Geneva Conventions. This legalistic approach, however sterile it may have appeared to American military planners, became the single most powerful factor in shattering the Nazi propaganda for the German prisoners. The Reich had indoctrinated its people to believe that the degenerate democracies lack honor and would therefore ignore all international law to inflict maximum cruelty. The reality was that the U.S. Army viewed adherence to the Geneva Conventions as a matter of cold, rational efficiency and a crucial tool of long-term psychological warfare. The regulations mandated that prisoners must be properly fed, housed in sanitary conditions, allowed correspondence, provided medical care, and treated with respect appropriate to their rank. These rules were enforced across over 70 major camps in Texas and hundreds more across the nation. The camps themselves, rows of orderly wooden barracks, dedicated mess halls, infirmaries with clean linens, were physically designed to meet these obligations. The U.S. Army's logic was that a well-fed, busy prisoner was not only less likely to cause trouble, but would, upon repatriation, become a quiet, undeniable witness to the moral and logistical superiority of the American system. This policy was an act of profound strategic intelligence. When Lieselot Minart and her fellow prisoners realized they were being fed 3,200 calories per day, a diet that often surpassed the rations of ordinary German civilians still struggling under the strain of the war, it was a shock. But the real dismantling of their beliefs came from the continuous, mundane enforcement of rules. The guards using sir or ma'am, the access to libraries stocked with German books, the small wages paid for labor, and the permission to organize cultural activities like orchestras. This sustained dignity, delivered through the bureaucratic machinery of the U.S. Army, was a complete opposite of the capricious cruelty and lawlessness that the Reich's propaganda had promised. In a totalitarian state, power is arbitrary and rooted in personal fear of the leader. In the American camps, power was structured, predictable, and rooted in the impersonal authority of international law. The prisoners quickly learned that as long as they obeyed the rules, they were protected by them. This realization was a profound lesson in the nature of democratic governance and the rule of law, a concept utterly alien to their experience. The American adherence to the Geneva Conventions proved that the United States had a moral bedrock so secure that it did not need to abandon its principles even when dealing with its defeated enemy. This unwavering commitment to legal decency served as the most effective form of denazification, quietly teaching the German prisoners that the supposed savagery of America was a lie, and that honor, in fact, lay in adherence to universal law, even toward one's enemies. The American POW experience was a fascinating blend of practical necessity and unintentional moral instruction, creating a system where practicality morphed into perceived compassion by the German prisoners. The war had pulled millions of young American men overseas, leaving a massive labor vacuum in the nation's agricultural sector. Cotton still needed to be harvested, cattle needed tending, and food needed to be grown to sustain both the home front and the massive Allied war effort. Into this logistical gap stepped the 400,000 Axis prisoners, providing a ready, paid labor source that was strictly governed by the Geneva Conventions. the decision to assign German POWs, particularly women like Lieselot Minnaert and her auxiliary corps, to work on ranches and farms in Texas, was primarily driven by this economic and labor necessity. It was simply a matter of efficiency. The U.S. Army had labor, and the Texas ranches had a critical need for it. But to Lieselot and her group, this practical arrangement looked and felt like an act of profound compassion, utterly defying the propaganda they had received. Their work assignments, feeding livestock, mending clothes, cooking, and learning to ride horses, were not the harsh, pointless, soul-crushing labor they had been prepared for. Instead, they were assigned purposeful, productive, and often highly skilled labor. This work provided a sense of dignity that was completely foreign to their expectation of humiliation. Lieselot wrote in her diary, observing the sheer industrial and agricultural abundance of the American system. Every crate, every meal, every uniform fits into a plan. Nothing is wasted. They build everything like a machine that never sleeps. This observation initially focused on the immense power of American logistics, but that logistical power was used to provide an astonishing level of material comfort, particularly in the realm of food. The meals were an object of continuous astonishment. The 3,200-calorie daily ration, featuring staples like beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and luxuries like coffee, fruit, and even apple pie, was an emblem of American abundance and, by extension, a quiet form of generosity. For German women accustomed to the deprivations of rationing and the thin soup of the military mess, this continuous, non-ration supply of food felt like a miracle, a demonstration of power so immense it did not need to hoard or spite its captives. The crucial psychological transformation was this. The American system did not seek to break their morale through starvation. It sought to control it through order and sustain decency. The German women saw the practicality, the need for their labor, but they interpreted the outcome as intentional kindness. The fact that the enemy nation, which they had been taught to despise as driven by pure greed, was willing to share its abundance and treat them with respect while they worked on its ranches, was the ultimate contradiction that shattered the narrative of the cruel American monster. The American POW system inadvertently turned the practical necessities of wartime labor into a powerful, quiet form of moral persuasion. The food provided to the German prisoners of war in Texas camps transcended mere sustenance. It became a powerful, undeniable symbol of the moral failure of Nazi propaganda and the material superiority of the American system. The Nazi narrative of America promised starvation, deliberate neglect, and the ultimate humiliation of the conquered. The reality presented to Lieselot Minnaert on her first night was a plate piled high with beef stew, bread, butter, and a slice of apple pie. The shock was so profound that initially, she and her comrades could not eat. The food was so abundant, so rich, and so far removed from the thin, ration fare of wartime Germany that they believed it must be a trick, perhaps poison, or part of a calculated psychological test designed to gauge their desperation. Hunger, however, soon defeated their fear, and the simple act of eating became a daily ritual of cognitive dissonance. The food was not just nourishment. It was a revelation of American logistical power and an immediate, visceral refutation of the propaganda. Every meal was a concrete, material lesson in abundance, a clear demonstration that the United States possessed an industrial and agricultural capacity so vast that it could afford to feed its enemies better than the German army had ever fed its own soldiers. Lieselot's observation, the food taste of mercy, captured the essence of this profound psychological shift. She recognized that the capacity to share such abundance with an enemy whose government had tried to kill Americans and whose propaganda had thoroughly dehumanized them, was an act of moral freedom. A nation that was genuinely cruel or lacking in resources would have hoarded this food or deliberately used it to inflict misery. America did neither. The regular provision of high-calorie, nutritious, and sometimes even comforting food, like the quintessential American apple pie, was a display of quiet, confident power. It showed the German women that the source of American strength was not a reliance on fear and scarcity, as the Nazi regime preached, but on organization, industry, and a basic, almost casual decency that extended even to their enemies. For women raised on the ideology of racial struggle and necessary sacrifice, the sight of a constant, plentiful supply of food introduced a radically different worldview, one where abundance and humanitarianism could coexist with military victory. The food dismantled the lie that Americans were starving factory slaves driven only by personal greed. Instead, they saw a nation so materially secure that it could afford to be humane. The food literally broke down the psychological barriers of the German women, transforming their deeply ingrained fear into astonishment and eventually into a grudging respect. Each bite of bread, each mouthful of beef, and each slice of pie was a quiet, powerful voice testifying that the narrative of the monster America was a complete and absolute fabrication. The true power of the American system was not in its capacity to destroy, but in its capacity to sustain and share, even with those who wished to harm. By 1944, the United States stood as the largest prison keeper in modern history, overseeing the custody of over 400,000 Axis personnel. The sheer scale of this operation, far from being a simple exercise in containment, was recognized by U.S. military planners as a massive, subtle instrument of psychological warfare aimed squarely at the future of Germany and the Axis powers. The philosophy guiding the American POW system was coldly efficient: to control morale through order and dignity, not to crush it through brutality. The logic dictated that a well-fed, reasonably content prisoner required fewer resources to guard, caused fewer problems, and most importantly, would eventually be repatriated as an unwitting ambassador of American values. This was a long-term strategy designed to influence post-war reconstruction and diplomacy. The existence of the camps, hundreds of them, laid out with identical, orderly barracks, mess halls, and parade grounds, was a physical manifestation of American industrial and logistical power, the same power that was winning the war. To the German prisoners, accustomed to the haphazard, fear-driven chaos of their own system, the order, the adherence to schedules, and the sheer volume of supplies running through the camps was astonishing. But the most effective psychological weapon was the provision of cultural and educational activities. Camps were equipped with libraries stocked with donated books. Prisoners were allowed to attend religious services, and perhaps most subversively, they were encouraged to attend camp schools to learn English and vocational skills. The organization of orchestras, theater troupes, and sports leagues was not an act of frivolous generosity, but a deliberate method of managing morale, channeling energy, and showcasing the cultural richness of an open society, something the Reich had violently suppressed. Lieselot Menard and her peers, whose education had been narrowly focused on racial purity and military obedience, were exposed, often for the first time, to the concept of intellectual freedom and the value of non-military cultural pursuits. This exposure provided an undeniable contrast to the intellectual sterility of the Nazi regime. The U.S. War Department was making a calculated bet. When these 400,000 prisoners returned to the ruins of Germany, their collective testimony about fair treatment, abundance, and the rule of law would be more persuasive to the post-war German populace than any official Allied communique. They would be living proof that the Nazi propaganda about the savage American monster was a lie. The camps were thus designed not to be prisons of despair, but rather highly controlled, functional demonstrations of a successful, humane alternative to totalitarianism. Lieselot's eventual realization that power wasn't just about armies, it was about organization, pointed directly to the success of the strategy. The American system leveraged its logistics and its moral code, the Geneva Conventions, to wage a quiet, devastating ideological war that fundamentally altered the worldview of the future German electorate. The profound cultural and psychological shock experienced by Lieselot Menard was ultimately a confrontation between the propaganda of lies peddled by the Third Reich and the relentless logistics of truth orchestrated by the American war machine. The Nazi regime operated on the premise of manufactured scarcity, fear, and racial division, using these elements to fuel its war machine and maintain social control. The American system, by contrast, operated on the premise of overwhelming, well-organized abundance, driven by an industrial and logistical capacity that the Germans could not fathom. Lieselot, observing the daily life at the Texas POW camp, correctly identified this contrast. Every crate, every meal, every uniform fits into a plan. Nothing is wasted. They build everything like a machine that never sleeps. This was a core lesson. The same industrial might that produced tanks and bombers in overwhelming numbers was also capable of flawlessly executing the humane dictates of the Geneva Conventions. The trains that delivered endless supplies of food, the trucks that efficiently collected laundry, the systematic provision of medical care, all represented a level of coordinated, non-corrupt organization that defied the German women's experience. Their own nation had descended into rationing, bureaucratic chaos, and scarcity, forced to violate its own principles and international law to survive. America, however, sustained its principles and its vast captive population without ever appearing to strain its resources. The Nazi propaganda had claimed that Americans were morally degenerate and lacked the honor necessary for civilization. But Lieselot observed that the complexity of the logistical machine required and demonstrated a level of discipline, competence, and rational thought. Qualities the propaganda claimed were exclusively Aryan. The American system required order, hierarchy, and meticulous adherence to rules to function. This contradicted the image of the savage American. The ultimate cognitive dissonance lay in the fact that the machine's primary output for them was kindness and dignity. The seamless flow of food, the provision of clean water, the access to educational materials, all were product of the machine they were taught to fear. Lieselot realized that the American machine was not a tool of random cruelty, as promised, but a tool of organized, sustained function. This proved that the enemy's strength lay not just in its money, as the Nazi propaganda insisted, but in its superior organization and ability to sustain human life and order, even that of its enemies. The systematic logistical decency of the American POW camps, therefore, functioned as the ultimate physical proof that the foundation of the Nazi worldview, the idea that the enemy was a chaotic, lawless savage, was a fundamental, irredeemable lie, exposing the systemic failure and moral bankruptcy of their own system. The arrival of the black American soldiers represented profound, almost surreal, physical shock for the vast majority of German women, an encounter that fundamentally destabilized their sensory and cognitive reality. This was the first level of confrontation, the raw, undeniable visual contradiction that the Nazi state had worked so diligently prevent. The German civilian populace, particularly those outside major cities, live in a world of enforced, almost absolute racial homogeneity, a purity that was policed both through immigration controls and systematic persecution of minorities. Black people, as a demographic, were nearly non-existent in the cultural landscape of the Third Reich. They were not seen on the streets, in stores, or in public life. They were only seen as grotesque, demeaning caricatures and propaganda posters, as theoretical concepts in the Rassenkund textbooks, or as cautionary warnings about the decadence of mongrelized nations like America. Therefore, the moment a black soldier stepped down from a truck in the ruins of Wiesbaden or Mannheim, the women's minds were forced to grapple with a terrifying disconnect. The abstract, subhuman monster of the classroom was suddenly a concrete, armed, authoritative man. This was not merely an encounter with an enemy. It was an encounter with a human category that, according to their deepest convictions, was supposed to be incapable of existing in this context. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and visceral. The sight alone triggered a crisis of belief that transcended political ideology and reached down to the deepest levels of their personal identity, constructed as it was upon the foundation of racial hierarchy. For decades, their status as Aryan women had been affirmed by the existence of a meticulously defined subhuman category. The soldiers' very presence destabilized that personal sense of worth and order. The reaction was often a frozen terror, a paralysis rooted in the inability of the mind to process two entirely contradictory inputs simultaneously. They expected an Untermensch to be lurking, hiding, or acting with uncontrolled savagery. They were met with a soldier who had a rank, a uniform, and a demeanor of professional command. The black soldier's presence was a living, breathing proof that the propaganda was a lie, not just about character, but about existence. The physical fact of the man standing there, equipped and disciplined, instantly rendered the years of racial science lessons meaningless. The shock of this visual reality was a necessary precondition for any further moral or political awakening, because before they could acknowledge the soldiers' humanity, they first had to accept his impossible existence. This initial sensory confrontation was a first crack in the psychological armor that the Nazi state had so carefully forged around their minds. It was a moment the theoretical monster became a human fact, forcing the women to begin the agonizing process of questioning every belief they held dear about themselves and the world. The image of the black soldier, standing calmly in the rubble, was perhaps the most effective piece of anti-Nazi propaganda ever deployed, precisely because it was not propaganda at all, but simply the unvarnished truth of reality colliding with the fantasy of racial purity. The introduction of the horses at the Callahan Ranch was the single most liberating and symbolically potent act of the German women's captivity. Lieselot Menard had expected to be shackled to hard labor. Instead, she was given a mount, a tool of mobility that demanded trust and skill. The contrast was deliberate and devastating to the narrative of Nazi control. In the German propaganda, America was a soulless place ruled by technology and greed. The American cowboy, however, represented an older, more personal and human freedom. When Frank Callahan's ranch hands paired each woman with a horse, offering gentle instruction through broken German and pantomime, the scene was initially chaotic, full of nervous laughter, shrieks, and tangled saddles. This chaos, however, was managed not with anger, but with warm humor. The cowboys laughed not cruelly, but encouragingly, helping each woman back in the saddle, offering advice like, "Don't fight her, just feel the rhythm. She'll carry you if you trust her." This advice, trusting the horse, was a direct metaphor for their entire experience. They were being asked to trust the enemy, to put their faith in a dynamic relationship rather than a static hierarchy of fear. The act of riding itself was a profound psychological release. For months, the women had been confined, physically in camps, mentally by fear, and emotionally by the war. Suddenly, they were in motion, carried by a powerful, living creature across an endless expanse of land. Lieselot, concentrating on the balance and the rhythm, found that her mind was forced to focus on the immediate, tangible reality of the present moment. The wind on her face, the heat of the sun, the gentle sway of the horse, rather than the abstract, debilitating fear of the past or the future. This physical engagement provided a sense of mastery and competence that directly countered the feeling of total helplessness that defeat and propaganda had instilled. The trust exhibited by the Americans was equally revolutionary. To give a prisoner a horse was to give her the means to escape into the vast, unforgiving Texas plains. Yet, the ranch hands did not hover or guard them aggressively. Frank Callahan's philosophy was simple and profound. You run, you'll die thirsty out there. You stay, you'll eat well and sleep easy. We're not your jailers. We're your neighbors till this war is done. The boundary was established not by iron fences, but by the natural consequences of the environment and a simple, explicit act of mutual trust. This was a form of freedom Lieselot had never known. Freedom defined by responsibility, not confinement. When she finally managed to guide her horse at a gentle trot, she experienced a profound personal liberation. It was a feeling of motion, of wind, of possibility, a sense of personal agency that had been crushed during the war years. That night, Lieselot wrote in her journal, "They trust us. It is madness, but also perhaps kindness disguised as madness. They treat us not as enemies, but as people." The saddle had become the instrument of her moral freedom, proving that dignity and respect were not privileges to be earned through rank, but inherent human rights that could be extended even to the defeated. The style of authority modeled by the Texas ranch hands, particularly Frank Callahan, presented Lieselot Menard and the German women with a radical, functional alternative to the totalitarian command structure they had internalized under the Third Reich. In the Nazi system, authority was synonymous with shouting, rigid hierarchy, and the constant threat of violence or humiliation. Leadership was built on fear, demanding absolute, unquestioning obedience. The German women expected their captors to be domineering and cruel, reinforcing the system they had just escaped. Instead, they found a style of authority characterized by calm confidence, patience, and good humor. The ranch hands commanded respect not by demanding it through rank or fear, but by demonstrating competence and leading through example. When a horse refused a move, they did not resort to whipping or violence. They waited, spoke softly, and tried again, demonstrating a patience and measured response that Lieselot had only ever seen applied to the elite. They corrected errors through gentle guidance and laughter, rather than public shaming or punishment. This method of correction taught the women that mistakes were opportunity for learning, not justifications for cruelty, a concept antithetical to the Nazi school of thought. Lieselot observed how differently Americans seemed to value work and authority. In Germany, labor was a grim, silent duty imposed from above. Here, work was intertwined with pride, competence, and even play. The cowboys joked, sang, and engaged in small, light-hearted competitions. Who could mend a fence fastest, or who could rope a calf first? This integration of human personality and professionalism into the workplace was a revelation. It showed the German women that authority could be effective, even demanding, without being abusive. Frank Callahan's authority, in particular, was built on an unquestionable mastery of his environment and his trade. He was respected because he knew how to run the ranch efficiently and safely, and his commands were logical and practical, not arbitrary. His simple statement, "You all worked hard, earned your keep. That's all any of us can do," stripped away all political and racial prejudice, establishing a clear, universal metric for worth, contribution, and competence. This system, where one's value was determined by their work ethic and not their race or political allegiance, was the ultimate counter-ideology to Nazism. The German women realized that their captors respected them because of their ability to contribute, not despite their status as enemies. This profound shift from an authority based on fear and birthright to one based on respect and earned competence was a core moral lesson. It proved to Lieselot that effective leadership in civilization did not require the humiliation of others. In fact, the most effective system was one that uplifted the dignity of all its participants, even its prisoners. The defining characteristic of the German women's work detail at the Callahan Ranch was the unique manner in which their containment was managed. Their boundary was enforced not by overwhelming force, but by an explicit, deliberate act of mutual trust. Frank Callahan's statement, "We're not your jailers, we're your neighbors till this war is done," was a moral contract that governed their daily lives and served as the most powerful dismantling of the Reich's paranoid, distrustful ideology. In the Nazi system, a prisoner was viewed as an inherent traitor and a constant flight risk, necessitating iron fences, chains, and ceaseless vigilance. The American system, at least on the ranch, presented a different reality. The camp trucks only came once a week to deliver supplies. There were minimal guards on site, and the open field stretched out, vast and tempting, to the horizon. The women could have easily vanished into plains at any time. Yet they didn't. They were contained not by physical force, but by a combination of practical deterrence, the unforgiving Texas environment, and more powerfully, by a moral obligation born of the trust that had been extended to them. This trust was a revolutionary concept for Lieselot. It forced the women to choose, adhere to the moral contract established by their captors, or confirm the worst fears of the German propaganda by betraying that trust and attempting a futile escape. The fact that they stayed, worked, and eventually laughed and sang with the cowboys proved that the American experiment in dignified treatment was working. The women were being given a chance to prove their own humanity, an opportunity that their own regime had denied them. The trust extended to them by the ranch hands implicitly acknowledged their worth as human beings. It communicated, "We know you are enemies, but we trust your basic human decency and your desire to survive and contribute." This trust transformed their labor from a punishment into a shared undertaking. When the women helped with the cattle drive during a sudden storm, riding alongside the cowboys through sheets of rain and mud, their victory in saving the herd was a shared human achievement, erasing the invisible line between victor and vanquished. Frank's response, "Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all," was not a political statement, but an acknowledgement of shared effort and earned respect. The invisible walls of the Nazi mind were far thicker and more restrictive than the open fences of the ranch. By treating the German women as temporary neighbors and workers rather than permanent enemies and prisoners, Frank Callahan fostered an environment where the women were forced to confront the lie of their propaganda daily. They saw that the highest form of authority was not dominance, but the ethical restraint and confidence required to trust your enemy, proving that the American moral system, built on respect, was both more effective and fundamentally more humane than the Nazi system built on fear. The evenings of the Callahan Ranch provided a final, intimate assault on the psychological barriers erected by the Nazi state, a process culminating in the quiet, unifying power of shared music. Lieselot Menard and her group were accustomed to the rigid separation of soldiers and prisoners, the constant atmosphere of fear, and the absolute prohibition of any informal, human interaction between enemies. Instead of being locked away, they were invited to sit by the campfire, where the cowboys, weary from the day's work, would gather with harmonicas and guitars, turning the vast Texas dusk into a moment of unexpected, fragile community. At first, the women maintained their distance, sitting apart, observing the music and the easy camaraderie of the ranch hands with a weary, conditioned suspicion. They were listening, however, and the simple sound of guitars and the deep, melodic voices began the slow, necessary work of breaking down the invisible wall between them. Music, as a universal language, bypasses the cognitive barriers of ideology and prejudice. The ultimate moment of human connection came one evening when a cowboy, perhaps sensing the deep, unspoken loneliness in the silent women, began to hum and pick the tune of Lily Marlene. This song was not just a popular wartime hit. It was the emotional, unifying anthem of the German soldier, a melody known by heart by every German man and woman who had served. The profound irony, hearing the German soul song played by the American enemy under the Texas stars, was overwhelming. Lieselot, lost in the memory and the melody, found herself singing along before she consciously realized it. Her voice, hesitant at first, was soon joined by others from the German group. For a few fleeting, impossible minutes, English and German voices blended, harmony and melody intertwining, until the only reality was a shared tune, the crackling fire and the indifferent stars above. In that moment, there were no political enemies, no prisoners, no guards, only people bound by the same human experience of longing and survival. The ideological structure of hatred, built on the absolute separation and dehumanization of the enemy, could not withstand the intimacy of a shared song. Frank Callahan, observing this unprecedented moment of spontaneous reconciliation, leaned back on his saddle and said softly, "War ends sooner when folks realize they were never that different." This simple, profound wisdom perfectly encapsulated the power of the moment. The war machine relies on the fantasy of fundamental difference, but music and shared humanity reveal the persistent reality of commonality. The singing of Lily Marlene was an unconscious act of unity, a complete rejection of the Nazi lie that had insisted on the unbridgeable gulf between the two peoples. It was the emotional confirmation that the moral code of the cowboys, built on respect, trust, and shared labor, was capable of bridging the chasm of international conflict, proving to Lieselot that the greatest victory wasn't won on the battlefield, but in the quiet grace of shared humanity. The pivotal moment that fully integrated the German women into the moral community of the Callahan Ranch occurred during a severe, sudden storm, a crisis that demanded unified action and competence, entirely stripping away the artificial barriers of prisoner status. Lieselot Menard and her group had endured the initial psychological shock of kindness and competence. This event required them to prove their worth, not just as laborers, but as reliable, trusted partners in a crisis. One afternoon, a typical, violent Texas storm rolled in with terrifying speed. The sky instantly turned black. Lightning began to split the horizon and the wind howled. The sheer ferocity of the weather caused the herds of cattle, the lifeblood of the ranch, to panic, scattering violently across the open fields. In this moment of genuine emergency, There was no time for ideological consideration, no pause for the hierarchy of prisoner versus captor. The survival of the ranch demanded every available hand. Without hesitation, the German women acted. They ran for the horses, mounted up, and rode out alongside the cowboys, shouting, waving, and maneuvering their mounts through sheets of rain and thick mud, using the riding skills they had been so patiently taught. For hours, they worked as an integrated team, focusing solely on the common goal of driving the terrified animals back toward the safety of the pens. They demonstrated remarkable courage, skill, and presence of mind under extreme duress. When they finally returned, drenched and shivering but victorious, with not a single animal lost, the emotional transformation was complete. Frank Callahan did not praise them with flowery words of political forgiveness. His acknowledgement was simpler, truer, and far more profound. He walked among them, his face streaked with rain and pride, and said, "Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all." This was the highest compliment the German women could have received. It was a statement of earned respect, a recognition that they had proven their competence and their commitment through action. It affirmed the simple, powerful truth that their value was determined by their contribution, their skill, and their courage, not their nationality or their past political allegiance. This shared, intense experience cemented their status, not as prisoners, but as temporary, trusted ranch hands. The distinction between us and them was shattered by the sheer necessity of a shared human task. The following day, the moral lesson was made permanent. The ranch hands quietly hung a hand-painted sign over the bunkhouse door, bearing the inscription, "The German Cowgirls." Lieselot stared at it, then laughed until tears came, a laughter born relief and profound acceptance. The fear, the propaganda, the shame of defeat, all seemed to recede into the distance. What mattered in that moment was a tangible reality: survival, shared work, and the strange, undeniable dignity of being trusted to ride a horse and save a herd. The German women had not only earned their keep physically, they had earned their place in the moral economy of the ranch. The trust had been validated, and in validating the Americans' trust, they had, paradoxically, validated their own inherent human worth, a truth the Nazi state had tried to systematically deny them. The acceptance of a new identity, the German Cowgirls, was a final, definitive step in the women's psychological and moral liberation from the shackles of a Nazi worldview. The simple, hand-painted sign over their bunkhouse door, hung after the success of the cattle drive, symbolized a profound shift. They had transcended the purely political and military identity of POW and been granted a temporary, functional identity rooted in work, skill, and mutual respect. This new identity was not merely a nickname. It was a badge of honor, earned through sweat, courage, and proven competence. For Lieselot Minart, who had previously identified herself by her auxiliary rank and her association with the defeated Luftwaffe, this new identity provided a vital psychological bridge out of the shame of defeat. The Reich had built female identity on rigid roles: mother, auxiliary, loyal party member, all defined by their relation to the state. Cowgirl, by contrast, was an identity defined by action and capability, someone who could ride, mend fences, and manage cattle. It was a purely practical, non-ideological identity. The women embraced the label, recognizing that it represented a genuine acceptance from the men who mattered most in their immediate world, the people who held authority over them. The name also highlighted a striking cultural irony that continued to dismantle the propaganda. They were now embodying the very essence of American individualism and frontier freedom, values that the Nazi state had condemned as degenerate. The Texas way of life, informal, competent, trusting, and centered around practical work, had become their temporary reality, and they excelled in it. The process of the women's transformation was fundamentally one of depoliticization. Under the vast, indifferent sky of Texas, national allegiance began to matter less than personal character. The years of political hatred and racial indoctrination began to crumble when confronted by the daily routine of a life built on simple truths. The horse needs feeding, the fence needs mending, and we all work together. This experience profoundly altered their future perspective. When the war finally ended and the time for repatriation arrived, the women left Texas with something far more valuable than the material goods they received. They left with a new moral yardstick. They had learned to judge individuals not by their uniform, their nationality, or their race, but by the quiet, unforced dignity of their conduct, the honesty of their labor, and their capacity for kindness. When Frank Callahan gave Lieselot the new Stetson hat, it was a physical embodiment of this new identity. It was a tangible piece of America, a symbol of the freedom and competence she had earned. As the trucks rolled away, Lieselot Minnaert, wearing the Stetson, was no longer just a defeated prisoner of war. She was a witness to an alternative way of life, a moral system based on pragmatic humanity. This new, earned identity, the German cowgirl, will be the guiding principle for her eventual return home, enabling her to act as a crucial moral bridge between the two nations in the difficult post-war years. The period of mail exchange between the German prisoners in Texas and their families back in the collapsing Reich provided the most dramatic external validation of the propaganda's total failure and the extent of the American logistical and moral superiority. After months of captivity, the German women were finally granted the privilege of writing one letter home, a vital lifeline to the world they had left behind. Heavily censored, of course, but a voice nonetheless. In the quiet of the bunkhouse, Lieselot Minnaert wrote to her mother, composing a letter that was not a plea for rescue, but bewildered, almost unbelievable report from an impossible world. She detailed the reality of her captivity, the immense size of the Texas sky, the kindness of men, the abundance of food, the fact that she was learning to ride horses, and the constant, non-aggressive presence of her captors. Her most profound articulation of the psychological break was the sentence she struggled over: "Mama, they trust us. We could run, but we do not, because we are free in all the ways that matter." And famously, her reflection on the sustenance, the food tastes of mercy. When the heavily censored letters finally reached Germany, the reaction from the families was one of complete, utter disbelief. Lieselot's mother and the families of the other women refused to believe the tales. Their minds, still trapped under the total psychological saturation of the Nazi propaganda machine, had no framework to process stories of hamburgers, open fields, cowboy hats, and consistent kindness. The families replied with disbelief, worry, and confusion. "Lieselot, are you sure? You must be mistaken. They would never treat prisoners so well. Are you hallucinating?" To those back home, enduring the terror of Allied bombing raids, the systematic starvation of ration cards, and the pervasive fear of total defeat, the life described by their captive daughters sounded like a dangerous, delusional fantasy. They had been promised cruelty. They were receiving tales of compassion. The American officers who reviewed the outgoing and incoming mail were often amused, recognizing the profound absurdity of the situation. "Y'all are writing fairy tales," one chucked, recognizing that the truth of the American experience was so far removed from the Nazi lie that it sounded like a deliberate fabrication. But the reality was undeniable. The German prisoners, who were supposed to be suffering unspeakable torment, were living a life of greater material comfort, safety, and personal dignity than many of their non-combatant families back in Germany. This revelation, communicated through the censored mail, was the first external crack in the propaganda for those still within the Reich. It planted the first seeds of doubt about the fundamental narratives of the regime. The simple, honest report of kindness, the truth of the Stetson hat, the abundance of food, and the dignity of the labor proved more corrosive to morale at the home front than any direct Allied political leaflet. The American POW system had essentially weaponized the truth, using the testimony of the prisoners themselves to systematically discredit the government that had lied to them. The food taste of mercy was not just a personal realization for Lieselot. It became a whispered message of hope and profound ideological doubt for the struggling German populace, proving that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to despise, but a nation of overwhelming logistical power and unexpected moral depth. The climax of the war arrived not with celebratory roar, but with profound, almost terrifying silence on the Texas ranch, leading to the symbolic act that defined Lieselot Minhart's transformation, the gift of the Stetson hat. By April 1945, the wind carried rumors faster than the telegraph could transmit official news. The radio in Frank Callahan's kitchen, usually tuned to country music, became the sole convoy reality. Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead, Germany collapsing. When Frank finally emerged from the kitchen one afternoon, his face solemn, holding a folded newspaper, the words that announced the German surrender hung in the air like an unfinished thunderclap. "Ladies, it's over." The reaction from the German women was not one of celebration or despair, but a stunned, complete silence. For years, every breath, every decision, and every fear had been tethered to the war. Now, suddenly, the structure that defined their lives, however brutal, had vanished. The women, gathered that night by the fire, shared an unspoken tension. Relief mingled with profound grief for their lost world, and paralyzing uncertainty about the destroyed homeland they would return to. Frank, pouring coffee for everyone, stated the pragmatic American truth. "It's done now. You all can go home soon." The word home was a question mark. Home was rubble, displacement, and death. The process of repatriation began quickly. As the women prepared to leave the ranch for the final time, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken farewells. The cowboys, who had been their comrades in labor and their teachers in humanity, stood quietly by. Frank approached Lieselot as she packed her few belongings. The moment of farewell was simple, devoid of melodrama, yet weighted with all that had passed. Lieselot offered her thanks, her voice tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan, for everything." Frank's reply was the embodiment of the ranch's moral code. "Ain't nothing to thank me for. You all worked hard, earned your keep. That's all any of us can do." This final validation of her worth based purely on her effort and integrity was a moral thesis of her entire captivity. Then, he presented her with a gift, a brand new cream-colored Stetson hat. It was a deeply personal, powerful symbol. The Stetson, the iconic headwear of the American West, represented competence, freedom, and the individualism Lieselot had learned to value. It was a tangible piece of the German cowgirl identity that transcended her prisoner status. Putting on awkwardly, the hat too large but undeniably meaningful, Lieselot laughed through her tears as the cowboys whooped their final goodbyes. As the truck rolled away, carrying her back towards the ruins of her old life, Lieselot looked back at the ranch, the barns, the windmill, the men waving. She realized that the greatest freedom she had found was not physical, but moral. She had left Germany a prisoner of her own fear and propaganda. She was leaving America as someone who had witnessed the power of kindness and dignity. Whispering to herself, she found a new, fragile hope. Maybe we lost the war, but perhaps we can still win peace. The Stetson hat, worn over the ruins of Europe, would become her lasting symbol of the moral victory she had found in the heart of the enemy's land. The final chapter of Lieselot Minhart's story is not a conclusion of the war, but the beginning of a life dedicated to moral reconstruction, an existence defined by profound lessons learned under the Texas sky. The journey home to Bremerhaven was cold, gray, and slow, a stark return to a homeland that was nothing but rubble and despair. Yet, as Lieselot stepped ashore, wearing her simple clothing and carrying her American care package, a Hershey bar and a can of beef stew, the weight of the Nazi lie had been completely lifted by the truth of her experience. She returned not just with material supplies, but with a new, indelible moral compass. The kindness she had been shown in captivity became the foundation for her post-war life. Finding her home gone and her parents dead, Lieselot immediately began working as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. Her English, rough and full of cowboy slang, was a constant, living testament to her extraordinary captivity. She used her position not to seek vengeance or favor, but to tell her story, the story of the Texas ranches, the quiet dignity of Frank Callahan, and the absurd abundance of food that tasted of mercy. Her testimony had a profound, astonishing effect on both Americans and Germans alike. Years later, Lieselot would make the ultimate commitment to her new reality. She immigrated to the United States, settling in San Antonio, Texas, not far from the very fields where she had worked as a prisoner. There, she married, becoming Lieselot Mitchell, and opened a small bakery that specialized in a fusion of German and Southern flavors: apple strudel with pecan crumble, pretzels dusted with smoked salt. Above her counter, she proudly displayed the framed photograph: a young woman in a Stetson hat, standing beside a tall, smiling rancher. To those who asked, she would say simply, "That's the man who taught me what America really is." Lieselot's life became a living symbol of reconciliation. Her experience proved that the true antidote to political hatred and systematic dehumanization is the simple, unforced decency of ordinary people. The thousands of former Axis prisoners who returned home with similar stories of fairness and compassion became the first human bridges between the defeated empire and the victorious democracy, quietly laying the foundation for the strong, trusting relationship between Germany and the United States that would define the second half of the 20th century. The ultimate victory of the American POW system was not in the number of prisoners contained, but in the number of hearts and minds converted by dignity and respect. Lieselot's life proved that sometimes the greatest victory is not won on the battlefield, but is earned in the quiet, simple grace of forgiveness and unreciprocated kindness. The moral freedom she discovered in captivity empowered her to confront and move beyond the darkness of the war, becoming a permanent witness to the triumph of humanity over ideology. This story is a powerful reminder that decency can defeat the darkest ideologies. If you know of other forgotten histories where unexpected kindness changed the course of war, tell us in the comment below. And don't forget to subscribe and like.